Good morning, Noam. And thank you very much for participating once again in this video conference. I'm Kathy Slaughter, and behind me are students of the degree in foundation degree in history with English and history and sociology students of A-level. I know we're tight for time, so I'm going to ask the first questioner to begin, if that's okay.
Enough.
Okay, great.
Hello. As we see a worrying trend of diminishing civil rights, particularly regarding our right to protest, are there any lessons that we can take from the civil rights movement in order to protect these rights?
Well, the civil rights movement in the United States faced problems that you don't face. The South in the early 1960s, going back several hundred years, was a very frightening place. People who were young black students who were trying to register American blacks, just register to vote, were murdered, beaten, attacked, buses were burned. It was extremely violent and dangerous. There are plenty of difficulties today, but nothing like that. It took enormous courage for the activists, mostly young people, originally mostly black students. Others came from the North. Quite a number of them were murdered. For them to face the wrath of the civilian society and also the extreme brutality of the police and the state troopers, the security forces, that was no joke. The lessons, the movement was committed to nonviolence, but it's worth remembering that Southern blacks did carry guns just for survival. They were living in an environment where they could be murdered at any time. So a lot of them had guns, and some of the armed farmers and townspeople did provide some limited degree of protection to the nonviolent civil rights activists. But there was a group called the Deacons, black men who had guns, who were in the background offering some limited degree of protection to the civil rights activists. But the movement itself was a major triumph of nonviolence. And the lessons from that are several. Nonviolent protests can succeed under specific kinds of circumstances. They first try to appeal to the humanity of the aggressors, the violent forces that they're confronting. And secondly, they have to have support. In the case of the civil rights movement in the South, there was support from much of the population, the American population, mostly in the North. And it's one of the striking lessons of the civil rights movement is what happened when it moved from protesting racist sheriffs in Alabama to trying to confront racism in the North. It was immediately destroyed. If you listen to the rhetoric on Martin Luther King Day, the eloquent speeches, it all ends with his I Have a Dream speech at the Great March in Washington. Northern liberals were willing to accept that. They were willing to accept that African Americans in the South should have voting rights. And they were willing to condemn brutal, racist police tactics in the South. Martin Luther King's career didn't end there. Right after that, he turned to broader issues, to urban discrimination, radical urban discrimination in Chicago, northern city. He began to oppose the war in Vietnam pretty openly. That was not very much of a minority position at the time, even though the war had been going on for years and South Vietnam had been practically destroyed. He began to try to organize a party of the poor, not just black poor, but the poor. He was assassinated, as I'm sure you know, in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was coming to support a sanitation worker strike of poor working people who were trying to unionize. That's when he was assassinated. The night before his assassination, he gave another speech, I Have a Dream speech, which is not remembered the way the first one was because it was directed against northern racism. He described himself with his usual biblical rhetoric as like Moses, who can see the promised land across the Jordan River, but knows that he will never get there. However, you, the people he's talking to, if you keep struggling, you can get to the promised land of equal rights for all, an end to poverty and oppression for all, not just blacks, but blacks and whites alike. Then he was assassinated. He was planning to lead a march from Memphis, Tennessee, through the cities of the South that had been the scenes of the worst atrocities, Selma, Birmingham, others, and they were pretty bad. He was killed, but his wife, Coretta King, did lead the march. They got to Washington. They set up a tent city in Washington. It's called Resurrection City. Congress, which runs Washington, a very liberal Congress, the most liberal Congress in American history. They let them stay there for a while. Then they sent in the police in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., to smash up the tent city and drive them out of town. It was the end of the Poor People's March. Well, that's the part of Martin Luther King's career that you don't hear of, and it carries very clear lessons. We are quite willing, most of us, to condemn crimes that other people carry out. But it's a little harder to look into the mirror. As soon as that begins to happen, everything changes. In fact, there's a kind of a principle which is applied with near 100% unanimity in international affairs, domestic affairs, and so on. The principle is when there's some crime, the more you can blame it on someone else and the less you can do about it, the greater the protest and the outrage. The more we share responsibility and the more we can do about it, the less is said about it. It's even up to the point of denial. It works, the principle works with amazing precision. It's happening right now on the front pages, in fact. But the case of Martin Luther King is a striking example. So there are very definite lessons to learn. Nonviolent protest, if people have sufficient courage, integrity, are willing to face brutality, maybe murder, it can succeed with support, but that kind of support is thin because it's almost always based on this overriding principle. And until that principle is overcome, and that's something for us to face, we relatively privileged people, till that principle is faced, things like this are going to continue.
Thank you. Another question?
Pass this to you, please.
Hi, we're sociology students, and we just wondered if you could explain the function of prostitution in society.
Women enter into prostitution because they have no alternatives. It's not a choice that most women would choose to make if they had the choice between that and becoming an electrical engineer. I say that because of where I'm sitting at an engineering school, a professor at a university, working in financial industries and so on. And people should not be forced into occupations that are demeaning, that are oppressive, that can be violent. That's a social illness. It's not, you can't blame the women who do it, but you can blame the society that creates circumstances in which those are the options that people take.
How important do you consider the work of the ACMHR in the late 50s and early 60s to the eventual success of the Birmingham campaign?
Well, it was, the civil rights, Birmingham was one of the centers of the civil rights movement. It was one of the most vicious and oppressive of southern jurisdictions. The movement itself was very substantially Christian in character, not just in Birmingham, but the Southern Conference Christian Leadership was the main one of the main civil rights groups, the main adult civil rights group, alongside of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But there was a strong Christian element. Martin Luther King himself was basically a Christian preacher. It was obvious from the rhetoric that I just quoted. So yes, that was undoubtedly a critical element. I mean, you could see it if you were there. I remember in a demonstration in Jackson, Mississippi once, where I happened to be there, when demonstrators were being beaten bloody in the streets by the state police during the day, trying to escape to the steps of the federal building, unable to do it. In the evening, they would get together in a church, a black church, singing hymns, reflecting, creating a kind of sense of community and mutual aid and support, and developing the courage to go out and do this and face the same horrific situations the next day. I'm not religious myself, but you couldn't help being affected, maybe even overcome by the passion and the significance of the religious ceremonies that were undoubtedly having a major impact on the people who were participating under very onerous conditions. And that generalized through the whole civil rights movement. Not all, incidentally. SNCC, which was the cutting edge of the civil rights movement, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they were not, there may have been individuals that were religious, but it was basically a secular group.
Would democratic decentralization create a fairer, more equal society, or would it be jeopardized and hijacked by the greed of individuals?
Well, you really can't answer that in the abstract. It depends on other aspects of the society. So, for example, suppose, take, say, the United States today. Suppose you maintained the social and economic institutions intact, but you had representative voting throughout the country with democratic decentralization of the political system. Would anything change? Essentially nothing, because the political system barely functions. Popular attitudes have virtually no influence on decisions. There's very good scholarship on this. One of the reasons people don't vote, voting is extremely low. In the last election, November, the last election, the voting statistics are now out, and it turns out that in much of the country, voting participation was back to the level of the early 19th century. Now, that's a time when, of course, slaves didn't vote, women didn't vote, white males didn't vote unless they had met certain property qualifications. Very narrow voting base, but participation was higher then relative to the total population than it is today. And there's a reason for that. They may not read political science literature, but they're well aware that their own opinions don't matter. And if you look at the actual literature, what it shows quite definitively is that a large majority of the population, maybe 70–75%, lower three-quarters on the income scale, their opinions have absolutely no effect on policy. Their representatives just pay no attention to them. There's a radical dissociation between opinion and policy. As you move up the scale, you get a little more influence, but it's not until you get to the very top, and top means like 0.1%, that you basically see policy made. So if you had democratic decentralization in the political system, but maintained the narrow concentration of economic and social power, which of course translates immediately into political power, then nothing much change. On the other hand, if you had true democratic decentralization, which means democratic control of institutions, manufacturing institutions, retail, commerce, finance, if all of that was under democratic control, well, it would be a different society, radically different.
Take another question. Yep.
Hi, I was just wondering about your thoughts on the recent Ferguson protests and if there were any similarities to the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Well, Ferguson sparked it, but there were other cases very quickly in Cleveland and New York, and there's now a substantial protest against police violence and racism, which is just a reflection of the society. It's not that the police are particularly brutal, that's the way the society treats African Americans, black males, basically. Take a look at incarceration. Who's in prison? Overwhelmingly black males, not because they commit more crimes, because the system is designed to criminalize black life, black male life. The technique that's putting aside police violence, which is just one reflection of it, the current device for criminalizing black society is what's called the drug war. It was actually initiated by Nixon, but it really took off under Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an extreme racist. The drug war was designed so as to target mostly black males. That goes from police procedures. So, for example, the police don't go into white privileged suburbs to arrest executives who are using cocaine in their homes. They'd never dare to do that. But they do go into black ghettos, and if they find a 15-year-old kid with a joint in his pocket, he can be arrested. Beginning with police procedures, which are not designed by the officers, but rather by their superiors, ultimately their civilian superiors, all the way up to the planning at the state and national level, beginning with police procedures up through sentencing, on to treatment in the prisons, on to the punitive measures that are undertaken if people are released from prison. Right through that whole system, it's radically racist, and it ends up with a huge number of black males in prison, not because, say in the case of drugs, not because they use drugs more. In fact, blacks and whites use drugs at about the same level, but the punishment incarceration, driving out of the society permanently even after they get out. All of that targets black males. This is, by now, black women to an extent, and also Hispanics to a certain extent, but primarily African American males. Furthermore, this goes way back in American history. It's nothing new. You take a look at the history of African Americans in the United States. The first slaves were brought about 400 years ago to right where I'm sitting, Massachusetts. That's 400 years. Up until the Civil War, the vast majority of blacks, millions of them, were either killed on the Atlantic Passage or brought here as slaves, and they worked in slave labor camps. The plantations in the South were slave labor camps, camps where the character of life would have impressed the Nazis, about the same as Nazi concentration camps, except for the gas chambers. There was massive torture used. The torture was very effective. One of the striking things about the slave labor camps is that they were cotton picking, first sugar, later cotton picking. The productivity increased very rapidly. Productivity in the slave labor camps increased more rapidly than in industry, and without any technological innovations. The only technological innovation was the bullwhip and the pistol. But just by torturing people more effectively, they were able to radically increase the level of cotton production. And that's why you live in a wealthy country. That's the reason, that was the basis for the economic development, not only of the United States, but of England. The textile mills, the commerce, the finance, that's the origins of the Industrial Revolution. And it was based on extremely cheap cotton extracted in slave labor camps by torture. The modern economy is based on it. Do we pay attention to that fact? Think about it. It's, as I say, it's not just textiles, it's everything that grows out of it, including the financial system which developed out of it, the manufacturing system. The biggest mills for a long time were manufacturing developed with textile mills. There's all kind of spin-offs into other kind of manufacturing. And it is completely accurate to say that the modern economy, the advanced economy, is based very heavily on slave labor camps where people were tortured brutally to increase productivity. Well, that was up until the Civil War. The Civil War formally ended that. And for about 10 years, there was a period in which blacks had a limited opportunity to enter the mainstream society. In 1877, 10 years after the Civil War, a compact was reached between the North and the South, and essentially the South, former slave states, were permitted to do whatever they liked. Federal troops were withdrawn, federal supervision was withdrawn. They could reconstruct the old system. And the way they did it, are we okay? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay, there was a break. The way they did it was exactly pretty much the way it's being done now. A decision was made, thousands of decisions all over the South, to criminalize black life. So, for example, if a black man was standing at a street corner, he could be arrested for vagrancy and charged, say, a fine of $10, which he couldn't pay. So he'd have to go to prison. And then the debts build up. He may end up in prison for life. If a black man is accused of looking the wrong way at a white woman, he can be accused of attempted rape. Then he gets a much more severe sentence. And pretty soon they had a large part of the black male population in prison. And that became prison labor. Prison labor is slave labor. In fact, from the point of view of the owners, say Andrew Carnegie, the great philanthropist who develop the first billion-dollar steel industry, a large part of it using slave labor in southern prisons. From the point of view of the owner, that's a terrific labor force. If you own slaves, they're your capital. You have to maintain them. If the slaves are in prison, you don't have to maintain them. The taxpayer maintains them. You just get them as slaves. Furthermore, they're not going to unionize. They can't protest. They can only do their work. The part that's kind of familiar to us is the chain gangs in the South, where chained criminals were picking cotton and so on, pretty much as they were during the slave era. But it was manufacturing too, and mining. A good part of the American Industrial Revolution in the late 19th, early 20th century was based on essentially slave labor in prisons. That went on until the Second World War. In 1939, wartime industry was beginning to develop, and there was a need for what was called free labor. So this system kind of declined. And there was a period, roughly the 1940s into the 1970s, when African Americans had again a limited opportunity to enter into the mainstream society. So say a black worker could get a job at a unionized auto plant, and there were unions in those days. Now they're mostly destroyed. That meant that he could have a pretty decent job, degree of security, buy a small home, maybe buy a car, get his kid to go to college. That lasted for a couple of decades. Then comes the war on drugs, which is reconstituting the system of the late 19th century, so-called Jim Crow system, and in fact is also being used for slave labor. That's the history of African Americans from the first slaves around 1620 up until today. You take a look at police violence in Ferguson. It's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from a rich background of extreme white racism, which is in fact the basis for your privilege and my privilege. That's how our economies developed and became rich and productive. And now we can kind of look at police violence in Ferguson and say, look how awful they are. But again, it's one of these cases where looking into the mirror doesn't hurt.
We have time for some more questions.
In your opinion, who would you say was the most influential spokesman of the civil rights movement?
Well, the civil rights movement, of course, the person who's most famous is Martin Luther King, justly, very important person. But remember that his voice as a spokesman ended with the March on Washington in the early 60s. He continued to be a civil rights spokesman, but his voice was stilled. You hear and read very little about what he did during the last phase of his life, when he was seeking to organize a poor people's movement for justice and equity for the general population. That's gone. Others have continued, and there's no one of his renown, but people continue to struggle for civil and human rights. In fact, take, say, the most effective civil rights movement that developed in the 1960s had nothing to do with Martin Luther King. It's the women's movement. It began, the first signs of it were beginning. Of course, it goes way back historically, but it really began to take off really in the 1970s. And it had an enormous impact. I don't know what this college was like 50 years ago, if it even existed, but if you take a look around the room now, it's about half women. My own university, MIT, is the same, about half women. When I got here in the mid-1950s, there were no women, maybe 2 or 3 women faculty, a scattering of women students, but basically no women. It was a male university. And that's changed dramatically throughout the whole society. Now, that's a real achievement of civil rights. It also came from nonviolent protest. It had its spokespersons, you know them, some of them eloquent, but the main thing was just plenty of activism on the ground, consciousness-raising groups, actions undertaken to demand rights, and finally it broke through. In the United States, just to give an example, when the U.S. was founded, it took over British common law, of course, the law that you read in Blackstone. According to British common law, women were not persons. They were property. A woman was the property of her father, handed over to her husband. The debates in the Constitutional Convention about women vote, should women have the right to vote, one of the arguments against it was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have 2 votes, since obviously the property votes the way its owner votes. So women were denied the right to vote. Women were denied the right to serve on federal juries. Juries are supposed to be juries of your peers. That goes back to Magna Carta. And women weren't peers because they weren't persons. In fact, it wasn't until 1975 that women were granted the right to be jurors in federal juries. That means recognized to be peers, to be actual persons. That's a pretty significant civil rights achievement. In fact, the greatest one that came out of the 1960s activism. It didn't really barely began in the 60s, took off in the 70s. And there's a good deal more. Gay rights, for example, are completely different than in the past. One of, as I'm sure you know, one of England's great war heroes, also one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing, was basically murdered by the British government in I think it was 1954, when they were going to cure him of his disease of homosexuality, and forced treatments on him, which led to his death. He was the person who was responsible for breaking the German codes in the early 40s, which saved Britain from destruction, from bombing. And as I say, was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, founded modern computer science, among other things. Well, he was murdered by the British government for the crime of homosexuality. Just, I think, last year, or the year before, was the centenary of his birth. And Prime Minister Cameron was asked whether he could commute the sentence. Of course, he's long dead, but could he receive a posthumous pardon? And the Prime Minister refused. He said he broke the laws of England, and you can't be pardoned for that. He broke the laws of England by being a homosexual, so he was murdered. Well, that's not that far in the past, and though it's still happening, as Cameron's comments indicated, it's vastly changed. It's another achievement of civil rights. And there are others, but the worst ones, the crime of slavery and its impact on the black communities of much of the world, primarily the United States, that remains. It remains. We have all over the United States, small towns even, you have Holocaust museums. You have courses in elementary school on Holocaust studies. You have Holocaust studies departments in universities. Try to find a museum of African slavery or courses on what I just described, the history of African Americans, the background for the kinds of things you see in Ferguson. Try to find that. You won't. Similarly, try to find museums of the other major crime of American society. And remember, that's Britain. That means British colonists. The other major crime, extermination of the indigenous population. Virtually nothing. Again, the same principle that I mentioned before. The Holocaust was somebody else's crime. There wasn't a lot we could do about it. So huge outrage and memory and studies and commemoration and so on. These other things are our crimes. Not only our crimes, but the basis for our wealth and privilege, which should not be forgotten. Therefore, you don't discuss them. The principle that I mentioned before in radical clarity.
Okay, our time is up. And thank you very much indeed, Noam, for a very, very stimulating and thought-provoking question and answer session. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming and being such a great audience.